The June referendum date for the UK to stay in the EU or not is fast approaching, and the campaigning has picked up steam on either side of the aisle. And so has the drama. For example, Boris Johnson, the former mayor of London, the leader of the campaign for Britain to leave the European Union, compared the EU and Adolf Hitler's plan to rule the continent, which drew the anger of the European Council President Donald Tusk. In this edition of the debate, we'll discuss the chances of the EU leaving, or the UK leaving the EU, where the UK stands on it, including the businessmen who have increased their support for the leave cap. Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, advisor to the members of the European Parliament, Gary Cartwright, joins us from Brussels. We have investigative journalist Tony Gosling, who joins us from Bristol. I'd like to welcome you both. Gary Cartwright, let me first start with you, and I'm going to try to get some reaction from some of the statements that are being made. For example, from David Cameron, Britain needs the 28-nation bloc more than the EU needs the UK. Do you agree with David Cameron?
No, David Cameron's presenting this as a zero-sum equation. We need each other. We live in an interdependent Europe, an interdependent world. David Cameron is clearly fighting for his political life, and I don't think he's doing a very good job of it. I saw his speech last week where he laid out his stall, and to be honest, it appeared to me to be rather sad. But you could say this about the arguments of both sides. I could be very critical about David Cameron and some of his comments, but I can also be very critical about the Eurosceptics, and like many people, as has just been touched upon, I was absolutely horrified to hear Boris Johnson comparing the EU to Adolf Hitler. This is really taking the whole debate into the world of Yahoo politics.
Well, that's one of the problems, Tony Gosling, isn't it? That there's not a real debate that's being presented in some respects when you have a leader of the Leave camp, Boris Johnson, making those types of statements, at least according to some people. Because the people in the UK, at a minimum, need to figure out what is best for them, what's going to happen. But are those points being discussed? What do you think, Tony Gosling?
Well, listen, I mean, we do live in a democracy, and in a democracy you have to have freedom of speech. I would like to see the Remain camp actually engage with what Boris is saying and argue with him, rather than just say, oh, this is silly, this is a conspiracy theory. The fact of the matter is, what he said is that all these people, Napoleon and Hitler, wanted to unify Europe, and that is what the EU is trying to do. Well, he's absolutely right about that. Clearly, that is actually factual. And also, many of those people from the past, Hitler and Napoleon, have had it in for Russia. And we've seen also recently the EU funding massively the Kiev government to do a similar kind of thing. Look, what's going on in Europe at the moment is people are getting very fed up and very disillusioned with what's going on at the centre in Brussels, and they don't see that it's something that's working for them. So in a way, it's quite natural that people might want to secede. I mean, we've seen, for example, in Spain, Catalonia wanting to secede from this crazy system, the euro, to get away from Madrid, get away from Brussels, and to start to run their own affairs. This is actually a kind of defensive move by large populations, by regions, saying what you guys are doing in the middle is not working for us. And actually, the United States of Europe, we're starting to hear this term used much, much more about what's happening in Europe. And this is exactly what's going on. But if you compare it to the United States of America, it's a much bigger project. The EU has a population of around about 500 million people. In the United States is only 320 million. So you can see what's going on here is an attempt to create a United States of Europe, which actually may well be a bigger economic unit and a bigger, certainly, population than the United States, and all controlled from Brussels, all controlled from the centre, with very little democratic accountability. In fact, the people who are running Brussels, and this is why it's all been going so wrong, whether it's the migrant crisis or the economic crisis, are these commissioners. No one's elected them. In fact, what's happened is people right across Europe mostly have kicked these politicians out at the ballot box, and they're now running the show. So it's hardly surprising they're working in the interests of big business and not in the interests of small business and the ordinary voters around the continent.
Well, that sounds kind of like the TTIP argument, not argument, but the TTIP deal that's kind of up in the air right now regarding some of the revelations made. But Gary Cartwright, when it comes to the EU, even the President Donald Tusk, who had some severe words for Boris Johnson, has said that the EU has its own deficiencies. It's not a complete union in terms of how it exercised some of its rules and laws. What are the deficiencies of the EU in which Donald Tusk didn't inform in that particular press conference that we saw him in?
I can give one example which is very important at the moment. It relates to something called the Tobacco Products Directive. This is something which, you know, tobacco is a very contentious issue, and this directive has taken a very long time and a lot of horse trading to come to fruition. The final date for member states to transpose the directive into their national law is this Thursday. And this Friday, the 20th of May, is the date for the implementation of the directive. It's a very, very large and very complex directive. But where are we? With just 3 days to go, where are we? Only 13 of the 28 member states have even completed the legislative work necessary to transpose the directive. The tobacco industry is in a state of panic because they are bound at the moment by national law. Everybody's laws are different, but 13, maybe more, who knows, will have a common law. And this is very, very typical of what we see in the EU. Harmony and integration, they're words, but in reality we're not seeing this. And I think that what President Tusk has said echoes what others have said at high level, which we wouldn't have heard 2 or 3 years ago, is that it's not really coming together, it's not really gelling, it's not really what they expected. What we're seeing with TPD is a political failure. It's going to lead to very, very serious economic difficulties for the industry, and it is, by the way, opening the door to organised crime. This is the mafia's dream, the TPD.
Tony Gosling, some of the comments there Gary Cartwright made about the EU, what do you think? Do you agree with them, first of all? And of course, your viewpoints on the EU and its weaknesses?
Well, look, from what Gary's saying, I think it's really important that we actually, if you want to understand anything, you've got to see how you got to where we are today. And really, what we see today is Brussels and the massive EU bureaucracy, which really doesn't have much in the way of real democratic accountability. The MEPs that are elected, I mean, all they can do is kind of put their finger in the dike with the legislation, which is drawn up by big business. And incidentally, that's not European big business, that's transatlantic big business. So you've got the same gigantic companies, people like Microsoft, for example, that are influencing policy in the EU, that are doing exactly the same in the United States. So this whole idea of the US and the EU is kind of counterbalancing each other. It's just really an illusion. But how did it all start? Well, it started with something called the coal and steel community, back in 1945, at the end of the Second World War. And some would say even before that, with a 1942 plan drawn up in Berlin, which is called the Europäische Wirtschaftsgemeinschaft. This is during the Second World War, a European economic community that translates in. And that idea was to open up European markets to German cartels. And this was partly what the Second World War was actually about. Occupied Europe was made a wonderful playground and a market for widening the market for these giant German cartels, some of which actually funded the Nazi Party back in the 1930s. Also, the Council on Foreign Relations was funding a lot of things. They had something called the War and Peace Studies Group, which funded things like the Marshall Plan, devised things like the Marshall Plan. The IMF was being devised by these people. And these are big business groups during the war thinking, well, once the war is over, we want to have more influence on governments. And one institution I must mention is the Bilderberg conferences. These I've studied over the years, and they started just about 10 years after the Second World War. And the German ambassador to the United States actually said that this was where the European Union was first founded, and that these were the people that actually put it together back in the 1950s. And of course, Britain joined in 1973. We actually only had a referendum on whether we actually wanted to join or not 2 years afterwards, if you can believe that. And that was ratified in 1975. But then in 1992, something very strange happened. We then became something called the EU, which became a political union. We start to talk about the President of Europe, even though he hasn't been elected. And now we're a little bit further down the line, and we are massively, we heard, for example, David Cameron talking about creating jobs. Well, that's absolutely a joke. Where I live in Bristol is a big industrial city in 1973, with aircraft manufacturing going on, all sorts of fabrication, massive city, and now virtually no industry left whatsoever. What's happened is the other big European countries, mostly German, but also French, have basically cleaned out. They bought up and closed down the competition. So we've seen a real de-skilling, and also we've got mass unemployment now in Britain, particularly of our young people. And a lot of this can be laid at the doors of the bureaucracy of the European Union and the single market, which has sucked out much of our industry and much of our jobs from Britain.
Well, we can get into the economics of it, but I'm trying to figure out the remaining time how to spread these questions, and I can't help Gary Cartwright to come up with a couple of threats. One which came from the U.S. President Barack Obama when he visited the U.K. and he made that bold intervention into the politics of Washington's closest ally, the U.K., exhorting Britons to stay in the EU, warning that if they left, they would be at the back of the queue for that U.S. trade deal, namely the TTIP. Isn't that a threat, in a sense, by the U.S. President?
Absolutely. I found it rather, well, amusing. Amusing's the wrong word because this isn't funny. That on the one hand, Obama was saying that Britain and the US are like twin brothers. We're joined at the hip. We're always together. And then he said, however, if we leave the EU, we can go to the back of the queue. So he's obviously got some funny ideas about being joined at the hip. Let's be absolutely clear about this. The United States wants the UK to remain in the European Union because it wants the UK to be its Trojan horse on foreign policy.
That's a good point. We need to get some viewer comments in here. I'd like to get a reaction from you, Tony Gosling, after we listen to some of the viewer comments as posted on our Facebook page. We'll be right back.
The media is controlled by government, and yet they show things mostly to say vote out. Cameron loves power. They're trying to influence you all to vote out, but making it look like they want in. If you vote out, you are giving Cameron the power he wants. 99% don't want him there in the first place, and now you're going to hand over power to him? God bless us all and human rights. The EU is becoming a rogue organization, imposing socialist principles upon the sovereign nations of Europe. Oh dear, this has really made me laugh. Cameron will be calling us terrorist supporters again. Now he really is desperate. I still can't help thinking there's some reverse psychology going on here, but for what reason, I don't know. Cameron, are the UK people going to vote? Seems Brexit is a sure and a painful jab that Cameron is afraid of. When Obama visited UK recently and spoke against Brexit, some fellow British people criticised him in the media, saying he was interfering in UK politics. There it goes. People will vote, stay or exit. Then Cameron is gonna blame many people across the globe if exit wins.
Well, some of the viewer comments there. But Tony Gosling, I wanted a reaction from you. But before that, the other thread I'm going to push into my question here, or statement, and that is coming from Lieutenant General Frederick Ben Hodges from NATO, who said Brexit could threaten the NATO alliance.
Well, all I've got to say about that is good, because the NATO has long stayed its sell-by date. It was supposed to be a defensive treaty formed after the Second World War. Now it's gone on to the offensive, and I mean that, offensive in Ukraine and Syria. What we're seeing is NATO being used to actually take part in these massive global resource wars around energy. And also, of course, NATO is not accountable. It's a very dangerous organisation that's well past its. I mean, I would also draw a parallel with what Boris was saying about the Nazis, because Paul Hauser, he was a Nazi, an SS Corps, Panzer Corps general in the Second World War, and he became, after the war, he became the chief of the SS Veterans Association. He said the first meetings of NATO were actually formed from the international brigades and international supporters of the SS. So I think we need to take a good, long, hard look at NATO, because NATO seems to be expanding. It wants, for example, to have troops in Ukraine. This is extremely dangerous. NATO seems to be pushing us towards a third world war. I mean, the United States, of course, the major players in NATO, and what they're doing is they are putting their missile defense shields in Eastern Europe and Romania and threatening Bulgaria too, which is actually escalating us towards a third world war. So I think if Britain was to leave NATO, that would be actually a very good thing. We could start to be independent again with our military alignments, and possibly even align ourselves with Russia to be a counterbalance to the United States in Europe. So I'm afraid that's actually a positive thing to be out of NATO. And of course, it means a possible reduction in our military spending and actually to start to recover Britain's reputation abroad, because NATO has absolutely tarnished that in a terrible way. And if you speak to British troops, British soldiers, even some senior officers, they'll say that NATO's done no good for Britain.
All right. Well, Gary Cartwright, we need to get this in also, and this is about how 300 business leaders are backing a Brexit that came out, news that came out just a few days ago. That they're saying that the EU's or the UK's competitiveness is being undermined by the membership, and there's a whole host of people in here. Peter Goldstein, founder of Superdrug, Steve Dowdall, the former vice president in Europe of technology from Sony, and you have Goldman Sachs. MD David Sisme in there. Do you think that their support for Brexit is going to make a difference in terms of translating to votes?
I think it will, because the UK is a very business-oriented country. We built everything we have on trade, on international trade, and people do tend to listen to businessmen. The names that you mention are very big names, but it's the fact that it's the SMEs, the small and medium-sized enterprises, that are coming out increasingly against EU membership that will probably have a bigger effect. As I think Tony touched on, I've got a slight technical problem. I can't quite hear what Tony's saying absolutely clearly, but he was talking about EU bureaucracy. And when we hold meetings with constituents and with others in the UK, in the business sector, all we hear over and over again is EU bureaucracy is killing us.
Tony Gosling, we're approaching the end of the program, and I'd like to ask you a plain and simple question, since you're there in the UK. When it comes down to the people looking and monitoring some of the different stations and how the people on the streets are reacting to this, it doesn't seem like people are really that informed about what a Brexit would mean. Now, whether it's the economic side of it or otherwise, why is that?
Well, it's because we're getting a lot of propaganda here. I mean, just tonight on the Channel 3 ITV News, there was a big piece about how important it was to stay in the European Union with Microsoft, people from Microsoft. And then the announcer said, oh, we're going to hear from the other side now. And then suddenly the screen went blank. And they said, well, we apologise, we cannot bring you that report. And then later on in the ITV News Bulletin tonight, there was another sort of pro-Remain report. So there's a lot of propaganda. There isn't really, I mean, if you think about the spread of views right from one side to the other side, what you're getting is only a very partial view on the TV here. I mean, I did a video which is on YouTube entitled What the BBC Won't Tell You About Brexit. And it's actually done much better than the mainstream media in London on YouTube, and it's done much better than the Remain or the Brexit campaign's videos. So what we're seeing is a restriction of the debate, a restriction of the discussion, and the media being used, because let's not forget, the media itself is a giant corporation, and they want a corporate Europe. They don't care about the little people.
Very well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're fresh out of time. Thank you. Let me thank our guest, advisor to the members of the European Parliament, Gary Cartwright, spoke to us from Brussels, and you were just listening to Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From Mikhail Vitale and the entire team in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.